In the quiet town of Hollow Ridge, winter had come early, settling over the town like an old friend that refused to leave. The streets, usually filled with the sounds of children's laughter and neighbors chatting, now stood silent under a heavy blanket of snow. The wind howled through the barren trees, their branches heavy with ice, as if the world itself had gone still, holding its breath. At the end of Maple Street, in a small yellow house with peeling shutters and a porch swing that hadn't moved in months, Emily Walker sat by the window. Her red coat, 2 sizes too big, wrapped around her like a shield. The fire crackled in the hearth, but it couldn't quite chase away the cold that clung to her skin or the chill in her heart. Emily hadn't laughed in a long time, not since the world around her had changed, since her mother's accident and her father's death. The loss had stolen the warmth from their home, leaving behind a hollow, empty space. Emily's father, Jack Walker, had been a firefighter, a man who ran toward danger when everyone else ran away. But he never made it home from his last call. A wildfire had consumed everything in its path, and a collapsed beam had taken him. The town had mourned, but Emily, she had folded into herself, a little girl trying to hold onto pieces of a world that no longer made sense. Now her stepfather, Mark, moved through the house with heavy steps, his presence like a shadow in every room. He wasn't cruel, not at first, but he was distant, like the winter air that seeped through the cracks of the old house. He barely spoke, except to give orders, and Emily began to wonder if she had ever truly known what it felt like to be home. The warmth that had once filled their lives seemed like a distant memory. All that was left was the quiet, the cold, and the soft tapping of the wind against the window. 3 days before the snowstorm hit hardest, a knock came at the door. It was quiet, like the kind of knock that didn't demand but waited, as if it understood that the world inside had slowed to a halt. Emily heard it from the hallway, 2 short taps, then 1 long. Mark didn't even glance up from his chair, eyes fixed on the television. The house was as still as ever, the kind of stillness that made the silence feel like something heavy. Emily hesitated before moving toward the door, unsure of who could be there. She opened it slowly, her fingers brushing the cold handle. Standing on the porch was a man wrapped in a thick, worn parka. His face was framed by a beard speckled with gray, and he leaned slightly to one side, as though the cold had settled deep into his bones. But his eyes were warm, kind, and they seemed to carry with them a distant memory. "Hey, Emily," he said, his voice gentle. "Remember me?" Emily blinked, confusion crossing her face. She didn't recognize him, not at first, but something in her chest stirred, like a memory that wasn't quite hers, a fleeting whisper of something her father had once told her. This man, standing on her doorstep with a soft smile, was Mateo Ruiz, a park ranger who had been her father's old friend. He had promised years ago that if anything ever happened to Jack, he would make sure Emily was taken care of. And now, in his hands, was a small, brown-wrapped box tied with twine, the paper worn and scuffed at the edges. He held it out to her, his eyes steady. "Your dad made me promise," Mateo whispered, his voice soft with emotion. "If anything ever happened to him, I'd find you the brightest, bravest pup I could." Emily's breath caught in her throat as she reached for the box, the weight of the promise settling into her chest like something familiar yet new. The days after Mateo's visit felt different, though not in a way Emily could quite explain. Sonny had settled into their lives like a quiet presence, his small paws patting softly across the wooden floors, his eyes filled with quiet curiosity. He never barked, never made a sound louder than a gentle whimper when he was hungry or wanted to be close to Emily. But his presence was enough. He became her companion, her constant, the one thing she could trust in a world that seemed uncertain and cold. Mark, however, didn't share her sentiment. He didn't say much about the puppy, but his disapproving glances were enough to make Emily retreat into herself. At dinner, when Sonny would nudge at her feet, Mark would scoff, muttering under his breath, "It's just a dog, Emily. You're getting too attached." His tone was flat, dismissive, as if Sonny were just another object to be tolerated rather than a living being, a friend. Emily didn't respond. She couldn't. Instead, She reached under the table and pressed her hand against Sunny's warm fur, finding comfort in the small, steady heartbeat beneath her fingers. The tension between Emily and Mark grew with each passing day, though it remained unspoken, hanging in the air like an uninvited guest. Every time Sunny followed her into a room, Mark's eyes would narrow, his jaw tightening as though he were silently counting the seconds until the puppy left. Emily noticed the way Mark's patience wore thinner with each soft whine from Sunny or each little paw print left on the kitchen floor. It was as if Sunny's presence was a constant reminder of everything Mark wasn't ready to face. One night, as a snowstorm began to rage outside, the power flickered and died, leaving them in darkness. The howling wind could be heard outside, but inside, it felt even colder, more oppressive. Sunny, ever the calm companion, sat at Emily's feet, offering her silent comfort in the way only he could. Mark was snoring softly in his chair, the flickering light of the fireplace casting long shadows across the room. Emily's mind raced, her heart heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. Sunny was her anchor in the storm, both the literal one outside and the one that raged quietly inside their home. As the days grew colder, Emily found herself spending more time in the warmth of the small living room, curled up with a book while Sunny lay by her feet. The house still creaked in the wind, and the radiator hissed occasionally like a tired sigh, but there was something different now. With Sunny by her side, the silence didn't feel quite as heavy. She talked to him in whispers, telling him stories about her dad, how he used to take her on hikes in the mountains, how he would tell her to always keep looking for the stars, no matter how dark the night seemed. It was the first time in a long while that Emily had shared these memories aloud, even if it was just with the dog. She didn't expect Sunny to understand, but somehow, it felt like he did. His eyes followed her every movement, and when she laughed quietly at one of her father's jokes, he would lift his head, his tail giving a small wag as if he, too, had found something worth smiling about. Emily wasn't sure if it was the warmth of the fire or just the presence of Sunny, but she began to feel something stir within her, something she had long thought was gone. Hope. But despite the small comforts that Sunny brought, Mark's disapproval never wavered. The tension between him and Emily continued to grow, an unspoken war that seemed to simmer just below the surface. Emily could feel it in the way Mark would glare at Sunny when he wasn't looking, or how he'd mutter under his breath whenever she showed any affection toward the dog. It was as if Sunny was a symbol of everything Mark couldn't understand, a reminder of the life Emily had before he'd entered the picture. One evening, when the snow was falling harder than it had in days, Mark's patience finally snapped. He was sitting in his usual chair, watching the television with a scowl, when Sunny nudged at his feet. Mark didn't flinch this time. He stood up abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I told you," he said, his voice cold. "No dogs in the house." Emily froze. She hadn't expected it to come to this, but there was no mistaking the finality in his words. Sunny, sensing the shift in the air, retreated quietly to Emily's side, his ears drooping. Emily's heart hammered in her chest as she looked between Mark and Sunny, the space between them suddenly feeling impossibly vast. She could feel the weight of the decision pressing on her, knowing that this was a line Mark had drawn, one she wasn't sure she could cross. The next morning, the tension in the house was thick, like a fog that refused to lift. Mark didn't speak to Emily or even look at Sunny as he passed by them on his way out the door. Emily's heart was heavy, but she tried to keep her focus on the puppy, who was looking up at her with those wide, trusting eyes. She knew she couldn't let him go, not after everything. Sunny had become more than just a dog to her. He was a lifeline, a connection to the love and warmth she had lost. But that night, as the storm outside grew fiercer, the unspoken conflict between her and Mark reached its breaking point. Emily sat by the window, watching the snow swirl outside, when she heard Mark's heavy footsteps coming toward her. His voice was cold, biting, as he stood in the doorway, staring down at her and Sunny. "I told you, Emily," he said, his words sharp. "No dogs in the house. You've got to stop this." Emily's chest tightened. She wasn't sure if it was the snowstorm outside or the storm brewing inside her, but she knew something had to change. Before Emily could respond, Mark took a step forward, his eyes hardening as he pointed toward the back door. "Take him outside, Emily," he ordered. "Now." Emily's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing. She looked down at Sonny, who had crawled closer to her feet, his tail flicking nervously. His warmth was the only thing keeping her grounded in the chaos of the moment. She wanted to argue, to yell, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she stood up slowly, her hands trembling as she reached for the door. Sonny followed her, sensing the change in her mood, but never straying far from her side. She opened the back door, the cold air rushing in like a slap to her face. Mark was already behind her, pushing her forward with a swift gesture. "Go on," he said coldly. "Outside." With a heavy heart, Emily stepped aside and let Sonny walk out into the biting cold. She closed the door behind him, her hands shaking as she looked out the window, watching the little dog walk into the snowstorm. The quiet desperation of the moment crashed over her like a wave. She couldn't let him stay out there. She wouldn't. The wind howled outside, the snow whipping against the windows like a relentless storm. Emily stood by the door, her heart pounding in her chest, unable to tear her eyes away from the spot where she had last seen Sonny. She could feel the weight of the cold creeping into the house, but it wasn't just the chill from the snowstorm that made her shiver. It was the emptiness she felt, knowing Sonny was out there alone in the freezing night. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she glanced at Mark, who was sitting in his chair, not even bothering to look at her. He was pretending not to care, but Emily knew better. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating, like a dam about to break. She couldn't stand it. She had to do something. Without another word, she grabbed her coat and ran out the door, her boots crunching in the snow. She could barely see through the storm, but she didn't care. She had to find him. She called his name, her voice hoarse from the cold and fear. "Sonny!" she cried, her heart racing as she trudged through the deepening snow. The wind howled around her, biting at her skin as she pushed forward, her heart thudding in her chest. She couldn't let Sonny be out there alone, not in this storm. Her eyes scanned the dark, snowy expanse of the backyard, the snow thick and swirling in every direction. The only sound was the crunch of her boots against the snow and her own ragged breaths, each step harder than the last. "Sonny!" she called out again, her voice lost in the wind. Her hands were raw from the cold, but she couldn't stop. Not now. Not when he needed her. Then, through the storm, she saw a shadow. A small figure huddled beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the yard. It was Sonny, his fur coated in snow, his body shivering as he lay there, waiting for her. Emily's chest tightened, a mixture of relief and guilt flooding over her. "Sonny," she whispered, rushing toward him. She dropped to her knees in the snow, wrapping her arms around him, her tears mixing with the falling snow. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words breaking as she held him close. The days after Emily found Sonny in the snow were quieter, but the tension in the house remained thick. Like an unspoken rule they all silently followed. Emily had brought Sonny back inside, wrapping him in her old baby quilt and holding him close until his shivers subsided. But even as he slept soundly beside her that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that things were only getting harder with Mark. She had crossed a line by defying him, and she could feel it in the way he avoided her gaze, the cold distance between them growing with every day. Mark's disapproval lingered in the air, heavy and constant, but Emily refused to back down. She would not let Sonny go. The dog had become something she could not live without. His presence was the only thing that kept her from completely folding in on herself. And she knew, deep down, that Sonny needed her just as much as she needed him. But the house wasn't the only place where things were changing. Emily's days at school had become increasingly difficult, her thoughts always drifting back to the empty space at home, to the quiet house filled with more pain than warmth. Sonny was her only comfort, her only constant. At school, Emily kept her head down, focusing on her lessons but barely absorbing anything. The faces around her seemed so distant, their laughter and chatter like a world she no longer belonged to. She couldn't remember the last time she'd smiled at something other than the memory of her father or the warmth she found in Sunny. Her friends had stopped asking her to hang out after school. They noticed the change in her, the way she had withdrawn, but they didn't understand. How could they? None of them knew what it was like to feel so alone in a house that used to be filled with love and laughter. One afternoon, as Emily sat at the back of the classroom, her mind miles away, she felt a tap on her shoulder. Startled, she turned to find Riley Bloom, the quiet girl from the seat next to hers, offering her a small smile. Riley was different from the others. Kind, steady. Someone who didn't rush to fill silence with meaningless words. She just sat there, waiting for Emily to speak. Like she understood that sometimes you didn't need to say anything to be heard. Emily nodded slightly, thankful for the quiet company. In that moment, Riley felt like a lifeline in the sea of distance that surrounded her. The days after the snowstorm felt like they were slipping away, each one blending into the next with little distinction. Emily spent most of her time at home, her world shrinking to the small, quiet spaces of the house. Sunny remained her constant companion, his presence a soothing balm to the hurt she still carried inside. But even his soft, steady companionship couldn't erase the tension that lingered between her and Mark. One evening, as the wind howled against the house and the fire crackled in the hearth, Mark's voice broke the stillness. "You can't keep doing this, Emily," he said, his tone low but firm. Emily had been sitting on the couch, Sunny curled at her feet, but the moment Mark spoke, she felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. Not when everything in her screamed to protect Sunny, to hold onto the one thing that still made her feel safe. Mark's presence seemed to fill the room, cold and oppressive, like the wind that whistled through the cracks in the walls. "He's just a dog," Mark continued, his words cutting through the air like ice. "You need to let this go, Emily. He doesn't belong here." Emily's heart pounded in her chest, her hands tightening around the edge of the couch. She felt the weight of Mark's words sink into her, but she refused to let them break her. She couldn't let him take Sunny away, not after everything. The dog had become a part of her, a symbol of the love and safety she had once known. She stood up slowly, feeling a surge of anger rising in her chest. "No," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I won't let you take him. He stays." Mark's eyes darkened, his jaw tightening as he stood, his frame looming over her. "You don't get to make the rules here," he said, his voice rising. "I'm the one who's been trying to take care of you, trying to make this work, and you keep defying me. I won't stand for it." Emily's throat tightened, but she held her ground, her eyes never leaving his. The silence that followed felt thick, suffocating, like the world itself was holding its breath. It was a battle that neither of them could win, but Emily knew, deep down, that this was a fight she couldn't afford to lose. The air in the house felt heavier than usual, thick with unsaid words and the weight of what had just happened. Emily stood frozen in the hallway, the sound of Mark's footsteps retreating into the other room, leaving her alone with the crushing silence. She could still feel the coldness of his words pressing against her chest, and the fight she just had with him echoed in her mind like a broken record. Her hands trembled as she reached down to scratch Sunny's ears, but the comforting act didn't ease the knot in her stomach. She had never seen Mark like this before. His anger, so cold and calculated, had stripped away any sense of calm they once shared. Emily's heart ached, knowing that their relationship was slipping further into a place she couldn't reach. Yet, even as she felt the growing distance between them, there was one thing she knew for certain. She couldn't back down now. Sunny was her responsibility, and she would protect him at all costs. The quiet of the house felt suffocating, and Emily couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would things get worse? Or would Mark finally see that Sunny wasn't the problem? He was the only thing that was keeping her from falling apart? Later that night, as the house settled into a tense stillness, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. The snow outside had stopped, leaving the world blanketed in white, but inside, the cold seemed to creep into every corner. She lay in bed, with Sunny curled at her feet, the only warmth she could find. She heard Mark move around downstairs, his footsteps heavy and deliberate, but he didn't come up to check on her. It was as though he had made his decision, and Emily had made hers. The next morning, when Emily came downstairs, she found Mark sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the newspaper in front of him. He didn't look up when she entered. The silence between them was palpable, thick and unyielding. Emily felt the familiar pang of unease in her chest, but she refused to let it control her. She moved to the counter to make herself a cup of coffee, the small routine grounding her in the midst of the uncertainty. When she set her mug down, Mark finally spoke, his voice quieter but still firm. "You can't keep doing this, Emily," he said, the words hanging in the air. "You need to choose, him or me." The next few days passed in a tense quiet. Emily kept her distance from Mark, her movements slow and deliberate, as though she were walking on fragile ground. Sonny remained by her side, a constant companion in the whirlwind of emotions that threatened to consume her. She spent most of her time in the small backyard, where the pine tree her father had once adored stood tall and strong. The branches were dusted with snow, and the little paper stars, faded from time and weather, still clung to the edges. Emily would sit beneath the tree with Sonny, sharing stories with him about her dad, as if the simple act of speaking could somehow bridge the gap between the past and present. Mark, on the other hand, seemed to withdraw further into himself. The anger that had once simmered beneath his surface was now replaced by an unsettling silence. He no longer shouted or raised his voice, he just didn't speak at all. But that, in itself, felt even more suffocating. Emily knew that something had shifted between them, and she wasn't sure how much longer they could coexist in the same space without breaking completely. Then, one evening, as the wind howled outside and the snow continued to fall, a knock echoed through the house. It was sharp, deliberate, different from the usual knocks they'd gotten over the years. Emily hesitated, unsure whether to answer, but the sound came again, more insistent this time. With a deep breath, she stood up, her heart racing. Emily walked slowly to the door, her pulse quickening with every step. She glanced back at Sonny, who was watching her with curious eyes, sensing the change in the air. When she opened the door, she was surprised to find Riley Bloom standing on the other side, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Hi, Emily," Riley said, her voice soft but steady. I wanted to check in on you. I know things have been tough, and I just thought you might need someone to talk to." Emily was taken aback by the sudden visit. She hadn't expected to see Riley, but there was something comforting about her presence, something that made the weight of the past few days feel a little less heavy. Without saying anything, she stepped aside to let Riley in, closing the door behind her. Riley smiled faintly as she entered, her eyes scanning the room, lingering on the quiet space where Emily had been spending most of her time. "I brought you some tea," Riley said, holding up a thermos. "I thought it might help with the cold." Emily nodded, grateful for the gesture. She felt a quiet relief wash over her, knowing that, for the first time in a while, someone cared enough to reach out. As they sat down together with Sonny curled up by their feet, Emily realized that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she had felt. The following days felt like a blur for Emily, a delicate balance between the new normal and the shadow of what had been. Sonny remained her anchor, his presence a constant comfort, but the tension with Mark only grew. She avoided him as much as possible, retreating to the small corners of the house where she could be alone. When she wasn't with Sonny, she spent time reflecting on the letter her father had left behind, the words still echoing in her mind. It had been a week since she found the letter in the attic, and it had given her strength, a quiet reassurance that her dad was still with her, in some form. But even as she tried to hold onto those words, she knew she couldn't keep running from the reality of her life. Mark wasn't going to change. The house wasn't going to feel like home again, and she couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. One afternoon, as Emily sat by the window, watching the snow continue to fall outside, she felt a sudden urge to do something, anything, to make a change. She had always been the quiet one, the one who kept everything to herself, but now, The weight of silence seemed unbearable. It was time for her to speak, to finally confront the truth. The truth that had been staring her in the face all along. She knew what she had to do next. That evening, after the last rays of sunlight had disappeared behind the snowy horizon, Emily found herself standing in the kitchen, her fingers tracing the edge of the letter once more. She had read it countless times, but tonight, it felt different. It felt like her father's words were not just a comfort, but a call to action. She couldn't continue hiding in the shadows of what used to be. She had to take a step forward, no matter how daunting that might feel. With a deep breath, Emily made her decision. She knew that the confrontation with Mark was inevitable. She couldn't keep living in a house where the silence and tension were suffocating her. It wasn't just about Sunny anymore. It was about reclaiming her voice, her safety, and her future. The weight of the decision pressed heavily on her chest, but she didn't back down. The next morning, as the house was still asleep, Emily stood in front of the mirror, taking a long look at herself. She wasn't the same person she had been when she first moved in with Mark. She was stronger now, braver, and ready to face what came next. With one final look at Sunny, who sat quietly by her side, Emily stepped forward into the next chapter of her life. Uncertain, but determined. The snow had finally stopped falling, leaving behind a quiet blanket of white that stretched across the town like a fresh start. Emily stood outside, her breath visible in the cold air, holding Sunny's leash loosely in her hand as he tugged playfully at the snow. She had not felt this calm in weeks, maybe even months. The weight of the past was still there, lingering in the corners of her mind, but it no longer felt insurmountable. She had taken the first step, and it had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. Inside the house, Mark's absence was palpable. The tension that had once filled every room was now replaced by a strange, empty quiet. Emily had made her choice. She had stood up to him, telling him that she wouldn't allow him to control her life, that she was not going to lose herself just to keep the peace. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew she couldn't keep living in fear of his anger or his cold indifference. She had packed a small bag, gathered a few important things, and left. Sunny had followed her every step of the way, never questioning, always there with his steady presence. The house, the one she had once called home, was no longer hers. Not in the way it used to be. It was time to move on, to build a new life, even if that life seemed uncertain. Standing in the yard now, Emily took a deep breath, feeling the crisp winter air fill her lungs. The world felt wide and full of possibilities. She looked down at Sunny, who was now sitting calmly at her feet, looking up at her with those trusting eyes. He had been there for her through it all, and now they were going to face the future together. Emily knew that this moment was only the beginning, but it felt like a victory. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't weighed down by the burden of someone else's expectations. She had found her voice, and it had changed everything. The house behind her, now a symbol of her past, no longer held any power over her. She had stepped outside, quite literally and figuratively, and it felt freeing. As she turned to leave the yard, ready to walk down the path toward the life she was about to rebuild, something caught her eye. The old pine tree in the backyard, her father's tree, stood tall and proud, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. The small paper stars still clung to its limbs, faded and worn, but they were there, reminding her of the times when life had seemed simpler. She smiled softly, remembering the nights when her father would hang the stars, just for her. Those stars had always been a symbol of hope, even when things were darkest. She took a step closer to the tree, reaching up to touch one of the stars. It felt delicate beneath her fingertips, but it also felt like a promise. She had made it through the hardest parts, and now she could move forward with her head held high. Turning back toward the house, Emily knew that she would carry her father's love and wisdom with her every step of the way. Sunny, her loyal companion, wagged his tail, sensing her quiet strength. Together, they would face whatever came next. It wasn't going to be easy, but with every step they took, they were building something new, something stronger. And this time, Emily was ready to let go of the past and embrace whatever the future had in store.